A lot of our speakers this morning talked about the cost issue, and you've heard a lot of numbers that were bandied about. Our next speaker is going to speak specifically about the cost issue of decarbonization, especially in the power grid. Dan Shreve is the global head of energy storage with Wood MacKenzie. Dan has 20 years of experience within the power and renewable sector. He leads a research team responsible for delivering strategic market intelligence, spanning both commercial and technical issues impacting energy storage's role within the energy transition. Dan is a recognized authority on the decarbonization of power markets and the global renewable energy sector. Dan has a BSME in mechanical engineering from Rochester Polytechnic Institute and an MBA from the University of New York. Dan.
Thanks very much for NJBIA for inviting me today to speak on this very important topic. As Ray had mentioned, I head up our global energy storage practice here at Wood MacKenzie. For folks that aren't familiar with Wood MacKenzie, we are a global market advisory and consultancy firm. We are focused on a number of major verticals, of which energy is one of them. And I sit within the energy transition practice within the business. As you look at, hopefully everyone can see the screen. Just a quick note about our general makeup. The group is global in nature. As I mentioned, we're covering a number of different verticals. Energy transition practice has been a massive focus for our team. Here in the last couple of years, we made a number of key acquisitions to support that effort, specifically May Consulting, Green Tech Media, all of which have come to build a very robust team that's looking at this specific area of decarbonization day in and day out. So with that, we'll get into the pitch. And what we're going to talk about, three major pillars of the discussion today. Firstly and foremost is we are looking at this as really a last chance for a true acceleration of the energy transition in the US. And I say acceleration because we've come such a very long way. When you start talking about wind energy, onshore wind energy, offshore wind energy, prospects moving forward, the solar space, standalone storage, the market's moving exceptionally quickly, and we are transitioning. But as most know, if you're looking at the IPCC documents, talk about the 1.5 degree scenario, 2 degree scenario, et cetera, more needs to be done, and it needs to be done very quickly. So where are we today? It's changing literally by the hour. So I've heard about the clean energy payment plan. It's in, it's out. Are we talking about tax credits? Are we talking about carbon taxes? Everything is being discussed currently, basically all options on the table. I think there was a discussion point in Politico the other day of just basically characterizing it as almost spitballing at this point in time. So there's a lot that's happening that's going to really fundamentally set the course for where we're going to be over the next 10 years with respect to the energy transition. So in terms of that energy transition, cost-wise, if we're looking at a 90% clean energy grid, it was what we expect to see come 2050 timeframe. That total capital cost is something on the order of around $3 trillion. And that's just for the generating assets. That's not taking into account transmission, different regulatory changes, other types of infrastructure spending. This is really focused on the power grid and the generating assets needed to support that transition. So how do you get there? We're seeing a lot of activity around tax credits over the last few years, whether they're by extensions, changes in commercial operation deadlines, qualification aspects, the whole nine yards. But really what we're looking forward to is an extension of those very important production tax credit and investment tax credits for major power generating technologies such as solar, wind, and also balancing components such as standalone storage. Lastly, we'll talk a little bit about EVs and electrification and their subsequent impact on the power grid. So firstly, accelerating the pace of decarbonization. This document highlights where we expect to see the market heading in terms of our base case. Here's where we're heading through the 2050 time horizon. 91% clean energy as defined by inclusion of nuclear power, hydro, wind, solar, et cetera. This is on a terawatt hour basis. This isn't capacity, this is actual generation. Now, what's being discussed in terms of an acceleration with any type of clean energy standard with a 2035 time horizon, obviously would require an enormous acceleration, a compression, if you will, of this existing base case scenario. So what does that mean? If we're talking about total installations, 1,220 gigawatts of new solar required. And this is front of the meter solar. This does not include the behind the meter applications as well. Over 400 gigawatts of new wind, and this is inclusive of onshore and offshore developments. Storage developments in excess of 500 gigawatts, and quite frankly, probably quite more if we're talking about acceleration here, based upon some of the duration discussions, the details associated with that storage deployment. So in essence, we are transitioning, but we're transitioning very slowly. So the key aspect of any of the discussions happening on the Hill currently is how fast can we go? Do we have the key components in place to do it? And what's it going to cost? So as I mentioned, what's that trajectory look like? This is using energy storage as an example. If you look at where we are currently in our base case forecast, you can see this in the light blue on the left-hand chart. And then we talk about what might be needed as we talk about an acceleration of that 2050 deployment, compressing it so it's done by 2035. And you see this massive ramp rate that begins to occur in the late 2020s, early 2030 time horizon. And what we really need here is we're talking about over 9 terawatt hours of storage capacity required nationwide. Now, this number is very dynamic, and it depends a lot upon the assumptions that are put into the modeling, and essentially talking about how much new capacity is being added to the grid, where is it being located, what are the transmission resources that enable power shift from different regions, and then energy storage being put in there as kind of a stopgap to make everything work. And then there's also massive questions about what can we do with the existing infrastructure in terms of gas combined cycle plants, coal plants, can they be fit with CCS in an economical fashion? Is anyone willing to do that? Is the regulatory environment going to support that? So this is basically characterizing that our current base case forecast falls far short in terms of what needs to happen if we actually want to get to 80, 90% clean energy by the 2035 time frame. Okay, here we go. Now, one of the things that's being discussed on the Hill is the Clean Energy Payment Plan as a means to help accelerate that transition. Essentially, what you're doing here is incentivizing utilities, load-serving entities to increase the amount of clean energy that's delivered to their end users. And on the surface, it sounds like a terrific idea, in a means in which to apply more of a carrot than a stick type of attack plan in terms of climate change, addressing climate change. Now, where we're running into some issues, of course, is that it does have a fairly substantial price tag associated with it. So around $150 billion is what's been bandied about. Now, if we talk about reducing the overall level of payments that are made to utilities and or eliminating the penalties associated with noncompliance, which was discussed today or yesterday by President Biden, what is it that we can expect to see? Now, there's a lot of discussion about the gross delta. What is this actually going to drive? So if we're looking at our existing forecast today and where we anticipate the market being in the 2030 time horizon, this is around 50-ish% clean energy generation, again, including nuclear, hydro, what have you. Now, introduction of the CEPP, if you're actually able to move the needle, in the sense that we're actually able to achieve compliance, utilities work wholeheartedly to address the spirit of the CEPP plan, then you're seeing an increase of about 27% if it actually is able to hit its target. It's meaningful. Is it going to get you all the way? No, we're still probably in those, that high 60s, almost 70% range. So there more needs to happen in addition to the Clean Energy Payment Plan. And also, to discuss that further, is it critical? You can also see that we are also on a very strong trajectory even without the CEPP. So the costs. When we talk about costs, there's a lot of interesting things that are discussed when we talk about tax credits, carbon taxes, how much is this all going to weigh out in the end of the day? We like to look at levelized cost of electricity. It's a fairly simplistic way of characterizing the overall competitiveness of different power generation technologies. Carbon tax has emerged as a bit of a Hail Mary option over the last couple of weeks, if in fact the Clean Energy Payment Plan falls through. So it's basically looked upon as being a difficult policy to enact. A lot of discussion in terms of severe voter backlash, respect to increased costs for consumers. How does it impact folks in higher income tax brackets versus lower income tax brackets? So what we have here on the left-hand side is a discussion point around what could happen here as it applies to existing gas infrastructure here in the United States. So we start on the left-hand side. A normal combined cycle gas turbine plant is delivering power at a rate of about $53 per megawatt hour. And so unsubsidized, and so basically when I say subsidized, we'll get into that in a moment, but essentially if you're applying a carbon tax on top of that cost of a combined cycle gas turbine, you're adding about $35 per megawatt hour to the cost of the plant. Now, Section 45Q, for folks that aren't aware, it's a special tax credit that is provided for generating units that are applying carbon capture, utilization, and sequestration. There's different types. You can either use it to go enhanced oil recovery, so basically making existing oil wells produce more effectively or for a longer duration of time, or you can sequester in some other fashion. And there's a myriad of different discussion points about where you can use that captured carbon, but there's a lot of discussion, of course, on how you actually get it from point A to point B. But in general, to incentivize the market, there's a Section 45Q tax credit. Now, it's nominally at this point in time expected to transition to about $50 per metric ton in the 2026 timeframe, for applications that aren't focused on oil recovery. Now, a combined cycle plant doesn't have that CCS equipment attached to it. So basically what we characterize here is if we're actually moving forward with the carbon tax, gas turbines move from $53 per megawatt hour upwards to $88 per megawatt hour. Now, how does that compare to renewables? We'll get to that momentarily. Now, if we add CCS to the equation, so now I have an unsubsidized value of $98 per megawatt hour, almost 2x what a normal combined cycle plant costs. The technology for CCS is very much in its infancy. We have not seen a tremendous amount of positive momentum within that part of the marketplace. Many of the pilot projects have underperformed. They've cost a lot more than what we've expected them to. So more innovation, more research needs to go into that. Now, when you're applying a $100 per metric ton carbon tax, the impact's minimal because you're capturing virtually all of the carbon that's emitted from the turbine, about 90%. The Section 45Q tax credit at $100 per metric ton translates into about $32 off of the cost. So now you're down at $70 per megawatt hour instead of the 88 above. So if you can have the right tax regime in place, even with technology being in its infancy, you can still get down to that $70 per megawatt hour range. The problem is that renewables are far, far cheaper at this point in time. So with that, if you're looking at the costs for your big three, so to speak, PV utility, onshore wind, utility scale storage, you can see the trajectories here, and they're very bumpy. And why are these bumpy? Well, we have production tax credits and investment tax credits in place today that are scheduled to phase out. Now, what we're looking at here is a different scenario where we're expecting extension of this production in investment tax credits. And in doing so, basically allowing it to run through the 2030 time horizon where it slowly phases out through 2035. So on the left-hand side, you can see onshore wind, a fairly mature technology when looked at through the lens of, or comparatively speaking, to utility PV and utility storage. The market is moving towards larger and more efficient turbines. The supply chain is very well established. The technology is very well established and very well understood. So in terms of the bump that you see in the 2030 to 2035 timeframe, that's really focused on the policy impact. And then subsequently, we see things trail down a bit. So you're around that $35 per megawatt hour delivered power in the 2050 timeframe. But really, if you're talking, you're actually hitting that mark in and around the early 2030s as well. PV utility moving much more quickly down the cost curve. Some of it has to do with chemistry changes, introduction of bifacial modules, a wholesale mainstream move towards single axis trackers. So basically all kinds of things happening there. One, reducing cost, but more importantly, also improving performance. So costs fall precipitously from 35 downwards to the low $20 per megawatt hour range as early as 2030. Utility scale storage, much the same story. Bit of a different reasoning though. If you look at where stationary storage is today in the marketplace for the global demand for batteries in general, EVs dominate. Energy storage systems are able to ride the coattails of the EV movement. And in doing so, being able to realize some of the very lower costs that are being introduced as a result of that mass rollout of EVs. Prices come down by over 50% by 2030. We're actually able to see unsubsidized energy storage systems being delivered at the mid 50s per megawatt hour range by the 2030 timeframe. That's tremendous news for folks. So if you look at these costs versus where we are with CCS, you can see why many folks are turning their attention towards renewables as being a primary driver of the energy transition. So the other piece of this, though, is this intermittent resources. It's weather-driven resources. So solar makes the most sense, obviously, in the Southwest, Southeast, areas which you have bright sunshine most of the year. And if you're talking about wind, it's generally speaking the central corridor of the United States from Texas upwards to the upper Midwest. Now, how do you connect all of these strong wind and solar resource areas? It's not all just about storage. There is a massive need for long haul, high voltage transmission projects here in the US. Now, there is some of that money is earmarked for that type of development within the infrastructure bills. But that said, permitting has been a major issue, and that needs to be overcome in order to get these transmission lines built. So if we're talking about dollars and cents, we have $70 billion earmarked for this small subset of transmission projects. There's a whole nother world of transmission infrastructure development that has to occur at the distribution level. If we were talking about introduction of V2G applications, vehicle to grid applications, how do we make power go both ways at the distribution level to allow new technologies at the grid edge for consumers to serve as generators? So this is just a drop in the bucket. We expect this to be a much more substantial dollar figure moving forward. So as I mentioned before, $3 trillion about, we're talking about CapEx spend for just the wind, solar, and storage assets. You're talking many hundreds of billions of dollars probably thereafter if we're talking about introduction of transmission resources, both at the high voltage side as well as the distribution level. So there's substantial costs that are involved just in the power grid itself. Now, if we take it a step further, and as I mentioned, the grid edge before, we also have electrification of transportation that's also driving changes within the power sector. And most importantly, really talking about the increase in total power demand that is required as a result of EV adoption. So we talked about how much the power generation grid needs to change over time in terms of movement to wind, solar, et cetera. Our load demand has been very, very, very low in the United States. I'm sorry, load demand growth has been very low in the United States for quite some time. Now, if we're talking about the future and where do we see positive growth, EVs can generate more need for electricity generation and as well as building electrification. This is partially offset by distributed generation, solar rooftops, commercial solar rooftops, things along those lines. But in general, the message here is that you have EVs that are, EV adoption that's expected to rise significantly through the 2050 time horizon. We're studying some significant uplift even through 2035, as you can see on the left-hand side. And on the right, you see that's going to have a meaningful impact on the United States power grid in the order of around 10%, so it's significant. Now, heating electrification, if we're talking about where we expect things to tally up, and I've got to finish up quickly here, I'm running out of time, but heating electrification is expected to increase power demand also in moving away from natural gas, wood, fuel oils, what have you. But in general, expectations are that you will see as gas consumption and oil consumption reduce, that you'll see an increase in electricity consumption, building electrification. And obviously it differs substantially depending upon what part of the country that you live in. But in general, the messaging here is that, again, you're seeing another stepwise increase in around 5% total electricity demand growth over time, based upon our base case, which is, obviously not as, it could be more robust, it could be compressed if we see some more positive traction in this part of the market. So with that, I'd like to say thank you very much to the organizers today. Thanks for having me on board, and we'll welcome any questions. I'm not sure if we're doing this via the chat mechanism or live.
I think I'm back on. Thanks. That was a lot of information, fairly quick. I appreciate you getting it all in. Before I ask a question, let me just turn to the audience and see if there are any questions out from the audience. So let me ask you one question. You ran through a lot of numbers, a lot of things being discussed, in Washington right now. I'm not sure if anyone of us really knows what's going on or what will happen as a result of negotiations in Congress. But of all the numbers you gave, and by the way, I believe you were only talking about the electric generation side. You weren't talking about the cost of EVs. You weren't talking about the cost of transforming buildings, I'm assuming.
Correct.
What does all of this mean at the end of the day to the taxpayer, to the consumer, to the resident who has to pay for this transition? Have you done any analysis on that end of it?
Generally speaking, most of our focus is going to be on the wholesale portion of the market. Now, obviously, that's going to translate down to residential prices, commercial prices, what have you. So certainly, we have looked at it. Is there expectations that delivered electricity prices change on a real basis over time? Yes. Now, the components of that are what is interesting to look at, though. So if you're looking at components of your electricity bill, electricity generation is part of it, but so is transmission, distribution, taxes, and surcharges, and what have you. What you'll see is, in general, over time, there'll be a need for additional capacity payments to help support the introduction of a large quantity of renewable energy. And also, like I said, that renewable energy is going to be delivered at an exceptionally low price, but it does come with a caveat. There needs to be backup in place in order to support that. Now, that could come in the form of that much more expensive CCS type of application. Now, it's going to represent a much smaller portion of the total build out, or I should say total demand, the supply stack, if you will. But it is going to be necessary. So it'll be interesting to see how things shake out at the end of the day. We do expect some moderate price increases, but nothing that is, I would characterize as exceptionally significant. Nothing massive in terms of step changes that are going to upend the economy or anything along those lines.
Thanks. Again, any questions from the audience? So I appreciate you being here today, being right on time. And Dan, thanks very much. Appreciate it.
Great. Thank you. And we'll talk soon. Thank you.